Okay, good afternoon, everybody in the room and online. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm co-director for the Center for Ideas and Society, professor of the Department of Black Study, and professor in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. It's a privilege to welcome you to Black Art Against the Surface with our visiting colleague from UC Davis, Professor Jemma Decristo. Thank you to Performing Difference and Blackness Unbound Faculty Commons Groups for co-organizing and facilitating this event. I open this occasion by acknowledging Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside, including epistemological, archival, and physical forms of Indigenous thought and being. The University of California is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by original and ongoing human caretakers, the Cahuilla, Tonga, Lusenian, and Serrano peoples. This colonial institution continues to be populated by Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is blocks away from the site where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller not long before I started working here. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which the university has a cooperating police relationship, is regionally and nationally notorious for creating cruel and fatal conditions in local jails for people awaiting trial and who cannot afford bail. It's a shared responsibility to address how the University of California is actively complicit in long and ongoing histories of anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It's thus with a sense of urgent obligation that I offer these words, this anti-colonial offering, in place of the sanctioned so-called land development. I'm honored to open this precious occasion by urging all of us to build on Rupert and Jeanette Costo's example by seeking new and old ways to create colonized, abolitionist, and liberated futures. It is also a massive privilege to welcome my friend, colleague, collaborator, co-conspirator, Dr. Jemma Decristo, who's an assistant professor of American Studies at UC Davis. She'll offer a presentation of her ideas, followed by a discussion facilitated by our colleague, Professor Anthea Kropp, chair of the Department of Dance, and a co-convener with Professor Setu Shigematsu of the Performing Difference Faculty Commons Group. Professor Decristo studies how sound, race, gender, and embodiment are realized in and as forms of mediation. Her current book project, The Aesthetic Character of Blackness, argues that Black representation is rarely or only ever incidentally for the people it purportedly represents. This presumption explains the disconnect between the world that espouses a so-called love of Black culture, all while precipitating a world that hates Black people. She is also working on a second book-length project focused on the language and structures of crisis management that encircle Black trans women and the depths of internalization of those structures perpetuated by the nonprofit industrial complex. Jemma is also a practicing artist working in sound, text, poetry, image, and movement. I must add that I came to know Jemma through the abolitionist community of the statewide Cops Off Campus organization, which helped catalyze a continental and transnational Cops Off Campus movement. I feel camaraderie with Jemma because she's everything you will experience here today and much more. She's an organizer, she's a militantly creative practitioner of radical and abolitionist autonomy, creative, epistemological, and otherwise, and one of the precious rare people in this line of work who emboldens maneuvers against and beyond disciplinary and violent institutions, including and especially the university and these so-called academic establishments. Please join me in welcoming my friend, our colleague, Professor Jemma Decristo.
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you, UC Riverside, for having me. Is this loud enough for everyone? Okay, that's about as loud as I have. So I guess I'll just kind of like give some context for what I'm going to present today, which is kind of, it's like the intro, I'll say intro, preface intro for my book that Dylan mentioned, The Aesthetic Character of Blackness. It's also I think it's the first time I've ever done what'll be, I think, a lengthier version of this. I don't know how much time we have allotted or how much energy people have, but yeah, I mean, I can always just stop it at a point. I'm not wedded to stopping. I'm gonna have a stopping point, but and it's, yeah, in particular, the book deals with a lot of different sort of historical periods. I go back as far as, in some ways, I'll even mention this, I even go back as far as the 18th century, but the book is kind of trying to grab at something about Black representation, and as you saw with the little blurb that I gave you, I have this kind of suspicion that Black art is this kind of rented space, and I use the word rented for specific kind of set of reasons, and looking at a double play on words, the kind of tenancy of Black art, like the tenancy, and kind of in a maybe like in like a kind of dialectical sense, which maybe you'll see it in the paper, like what it is sublimated to, or how it is sublimated. That'd be a good way to think about it too. And yeah, I'm going to talk about, a lot of this will be contemporary stuff. So I think it'll allow a lot of jumping off points, entry points for people. I'm going to put some images up on this screen in a second. I may sit to read because it's a little, let's get first. Okay, so, yeah, so people see this, or is, I think, a bit. Okay. And I'll move through these images. They're not, I think you kind of will get the idea as I go along. Okay. So I think I'll read, which I'll try to do standing. I guess I'm would be better. It's okay. We can move the table too. I can also sit too and maybe stand. I try to do that when I'm teaching, so hopefully that sticks with us. And I'm just gonna read, but I'll kind of interrupt myself too to talk about things. But this is a photo I took. I think it's a printed version of it in this art brochure in Paris. Weirdly. There's a photo I took of downtown Oakland. Some of this, what I'm going to read today is, I don't know if I'd call it a love letter. I don't know that I could say I have lots of little strong, but it's kind of a letter to the disappearance of kinds of music cultures, particularly hip hop culture, particularly Black queer cruising spaces that existed in downtown Oakland. If anyone, we can go back to Marlon Riggs if you think about that time. So it's not about that, but that's what it's to in a certain kind of way. It's dealing with contemporary Oakland, but as we'll see, it's not just Oakland. I think that's enough of a preface, and then I think we can go into it. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. On May 29th, 2020, a discordantly collective project took place to rearrange Oakland's downtown into the sublimity of the Black rage the city's unfettered real estate speculation had been actively displacing. This activity took place against the voluminous simulacrum of luxury condo construction and composed on land fallowed and quieted through genocidal settlement, prison and the policing of life that had for decades been turning downtown Oakland into the low rumble of an art murmur, which is what preceded a lot of organizations, which now no longer exists. Funny how that works for art. What is audible in the low hum of this art murmur is not espoused in the surface of their positive, beautified character, but against the daily operations of Black life, they aspire to commodify and memorialize. Against, in the wake of this cacophonous late May night, which when people hear the date, maybe this is after George Floyd's murder. In the wake of this cacophonous late May night, a compendium of equally important and equally discordant collective projects resurfaced, organized abolitionist teach-ins, robust mutual aid networks, and self-defense trainings, practices that never aspired to memorialization and never submitted their quotidian operations to the judgment of Black representation, or the unpopulated verticality of the vacant condo values, endless frontiers. Just a lot of what I'm talking about today. Were these murals, you see some of them, these all propped up what I'm going to show you, like in June. And you saw this in city. Basically, this is a, like to put it kind of, is a glorified beautification campaign, and we're going to talk about that. And hopefully the photo, stark contrast between now leasing luxury condos. It started, I want to say 3,000 or maybe a little more a month, and racism image, which the vagueness of which we could also talk about. But so were these right? Yeah, there's we'll look at some more. There's, if anyone does organizing in Chile, I had a friend, then you may know this dog who bit police in Chile. R.I.P. Presente. Were these murals an act of meaningful solidarity? This one is particularly intense. Look at that lovely condo painting in the lobby. Were the murals an act of meaningful solidarity with these practices the night of the George Floyd murder, or a couple nights after? An imposition of righteous force themselves, or a sentimentalized sanitation effort, a beautification project that by implication and comparison made the unmaking of the world seem ugly. The broken bank window glass and cacophony of riotous crowds was now hushed by a series of eye-level commemorative portraits. We can't breathe outside of you in the studio. Another one is like, streets once littered with riotous Black anger were now awash in the silent circulation of the city's normal. As a museum, we could only operate in once again with some scripted authority. If you walked fast enough or let the image absorb you enough and never looked up at the structure and force of their bearing forth, so like the leasing sign that Mary had up, you could almost forget you were actually looking at a piece of defensive architecture. A bastion to the blight of luxury condo lobby windows. These are all put on plywood that was put around glass to protect the glass from being broken from riots, which is a fascinating service, fascinating canvas. So you could forget you were looking at a piece of defensive architecture, a bastion to the blight of luxury condo lobby windows, a radical slogan commissioned to say silently, please don't break our glass. What does it mean to turn evacuated interiority waged against Black life into the plentiful surface that stages its value? What does it mean for Black art to be the surface of this please? What the surface of the image wants to never know is the sound waged against its process of valuation. The alleged sound of crunching, sound of crunching bank window glass underfoot, the all-surround of security alarm cacophony scoring counterpoint of properties theft against the plucked chords of Black rage whose voices it had territoried out beyond city limits and would try to territory again, and again. Like a stylist drawing lines along a record's grooves, only the scratches and marks against the surface throw the needle off the hollow of its perpetual frontier. Condos, tech company headquarters, banks, and businesses must have felt so helpless in their unanswered screams. For them, the busy presence of our living once again a void. It was the buildings who were begging for help for once, and not us pleading for survival, under the accruing weight of their closing in. Yet the images that follow would actively, strategically, and these all followed the protests, and these were all came up in June. Yet the images that follow would actively and strategically attempt to forget this force, the closing in. Instead, they feigned to be a breath or a speech out, starting a conversation, a dialogue that liberates our domination into the very surface that held and shattered under the weight of our adamant contestation. Our imaging increasingly liberates this surface. It does not liberate us. And without warning or consent, we suddenly become displeased, pleading in their ideal world, where there are still Black art opportunities, still Black art, but there are no more Black people. The surface of this please is the displacement that forms the art, or art objects, or character that I talk about and plotted in this book or this text. Character here holds kind of a messy confluence of representations process, which hides in the projected loftiness of its products. My arguments are thus not framed around cultivating Black aesthetics. That was something I've received complaints about, which I think are fair. I'm not trying to do like, this is a Black aesthetic, like an affect or something. As a canon of identifiable contents, for example, but delineating a problem space that allows us to think and understand how this world is not enough for us, and where some of that not enough comes from, and how indeed much of that not enough, or much of this theft that creates this not enough is legitimate. So historiographical arguments, which is not necessarily, including art historiographical arguments, tend to want to measure what is, whereas this work starts argumentatively from imagining what ought to be or what can be. Rather than understand representation as a savior from the specter of violence, as it is often instrumentalized, still in a very romantic mode. I understand it as a distinct and overlapping site of force, a process that turns the sight and sound of broken glass into an amenable, beautified, and sociable, which is a really important word for me. Back to the history of aesthetics and the ideals text, Black sounding image. So how the Black image is made sociable. And all the disciplinary measures that impacts. Representation and aesthetics are a process of regulation, even going back to Kant. Aesthetics at its heart is a regulative principle vested with the maintenance of lawful external relations in its modern formulations and institutions, not just of formal restraint, think about, but of being formally restrained, of being held back, of being arrested, of instituting as being institutionalized. Aesthetics is the frontier where force collides with imagination in the interest of value. So I understand aesthetics that not so much as is endemic to producing art. And though it adopts formal artistic production as an instrumental rationalization or technique, I would say, aesthetics is not even solely about producing judgments, and by extension, laws, though it does quite extensively do this as well. Aesthetics is about producing the austere sociability through which the social can be legitimated, realized, and above all, liberated over us. Aesthetics is about arresting our imagination for the maintenance of an orderly economy, forming what we should broadly understand as an art market. So the book that I'm writing, or that's more or less written, revising, is a work in the aesthetic character of Blackness, is a work and a figure for partially understanding the process of the beautification of Black people in life as Black art and Black music. And I start with the history of Black music, which, if you know, go to Frederick Douglass, our humanization, which I think really amounts to the humanization of the slave society after abolition, not us, because not in our terms, comes from Black music. If you can, painting doesn't have the same history for us, or with us. The practical critiques at the heart of this book, which I'll talk about towards the end too, disembarks from the grounding assumption that representation is only ever incidentally, and I use the word incidence as opposed to essence, for the people it purports to represent. And this assumption explains the broader instance that underwrites the experience of being Black in the world, noticing that much of the world espouses, as I put in my introductory notes, much of the world espouses a love of Black culture while precipitating a world that hates Black people, right? I think the austere contrast between a lot of the images I'm showing draw that true. For $4,000 condos with a mural of you on the side, which we'll see maybe an updated version if we have time, maybe from 2020. I won't for 2022. Our subtitle of this is Are Against Captivity, a Museum of Form. So the categorical expansion of Black aesthetic forms, which I think is very pervasive now, of course, in which genre perhaps the most obvious, but by no means only example, hides its arresting function in the liberating force of its work, which is how all work works under capitalism. It's a form of liberated dominance in the work of art. So the work of art and work. The disguised and liberated domination of the work of art now works, like all work under neoliberal capital in particular, as the mere representative of what it actively kills and displaces. This kind of work of art is what this text tries to conjure by teasing apart its force, the hows of its sociability, of its property, and of its proprioception. I'm use the Kantian word. To put it a bit more simply, I'm far more interested in the productive capacity of the Black artistic, to which the coffers of academic, which I've included, and institutional study can, of course, attest knows no bounds, because it's often, of course, our job to expand these categories. Indeed, anything can be made Black art. The safeguarding of its exclusive artisanal mode of production no more abolishes the reality than does its industrial or mass manufacturing, which are always both going on at the same time and are not, there's obviously a lot of Adorno in this, I don't think those are separate. art, like, you know, art institutionalization versus mass-produced art. I think they're mostly doing the same thing. I do not then invoke from form in this work, for the most part, as a litigious boundary or a dutiful guard against Black art's process of categorical production, right? Like kind of almost like a no true Scotsman argument or something about Black art, like, oh, that's not really Black art because of, you know, anyway. Because it is my assumption that the productive capacities of Black aesthetics need no further justification. And in fact, such justification, and I don't wage this concern for the sake of Black art's preservation, which is not really something I'm interested in. I would say I'm more interested in the preservation. Yeah. I do not wage this concern for the sake of Black art's preservation, nor the preservation of a pure Black politics. We could talk about that. The imagination of which I will argue is equally limited by and subservient to predominant modes of aesthetic categorization and representation. I mean, you know, as limited as the artistic imagination is, people still vote, so I think that's an argument. So maybe even more sad imaginative practice. Because it is my assumption that the productive capacities of Black aesthetics need no further justification. And in fact, such justification in this aesthetic justification, term, has been built on the abstraction of our lives and needs as the cultural and the aesthetic. Nowhere is this justification more entrenched than Black music, and no more overt is this paradigm than the late modes of Black art institutionalization, which I'll talk about a little later and talk about later in the book. So like really post-Black arts movements, which you know is more now, so to speak. My goal is to understand how the social is legitimated and contested over us through a process of aesthetic rigor that is eventually sublated and arrested in the Black work of art. Genre, form, and aesthetic reflection and comportment, of course. Throughout this, just at the beginning, I'm really interested in trying to like get at the potentiality or the possibility of esteem without what I would call verticality. And so like maybe thinking about what it means to hitch your ride to a vertical structure, right? So like a condo, to have your art on, or what I'll talk about later in a condo, right? So esteem without verticality so that we don't, because I think like, for example, representational politics are vertical politics that are, you know, where it is funded is still very more cheap. Genre, form, and aesthetic reflection and comportment are as, if not more essential to how we understand the social, then how might we distill their reproduction in the realm, or how might their reproduction be distilled in the realm of mere art? The contestation may be the contention, sorry, when people look at these, and I'd be interested to hear people's readings, eventually to that point. The contestation, or, you know, I can see this reading of them, I should say, maybe that the murals are a form of protest art, right? I think this is a common institutional perspective, right? Is to, and I'll talk about Darby English later or someone like that, who would be like, oh, well, these are protest art. That's like one genre, and like, you know, abstract art wouldn't be included or something like that, right? That through the surface of the paintings, the slogans and demands like end racism, demands and expositions of the needs of Black life for a new world can be rationalized and sentimentalized for viewers and passersby through or despite the process of production that materializes their canvas, right? So the fact that they're protectants for a glass condo window. This position concedes that the building's verticality conscripts the bounds of the subject and breathes life, and we can think of it breathes life one number. This position concedes that the building's verticality conscripts the bounds of the subject and breathes life into the mouth of demands as the automated proprioception of state and market authority, through which Black subjection becomes audiovisible. The form of subjection does not come from nowhere, and is not all there. It's not all there is, but has a genealogy I attempt to track with this book, this concept, the aesthetic character of Blackness. The mural surfaces disclosure of Black needs. So like I can't read. The mural surfaces disclosure of Black needs is beautified, relies on a strategic enclosure of a space of largely invisibilized valuation. the glass of the condo windows, or sure, yoga studio in this case, that they protect. Vacant condo windows and their peopleless lobbies. Vacant condo windows and their peopleless lobbies house the needs of capital. They vary the endless futurity of speculation through the mere aesthetics of life. Right, so like condos that are built to be intentionally empty, which is what they are. So you can create real estate comps. Of living, of dwelling as if they were ever meant to be housing for anything but the apparitions of Black life, lost in the predicates of their valuation as exploited labor, as incarcerated surplus population, swept in the public outcry. And this was a frequent term used by the East Bay Times to talk about hip hop clubs in downtown Oakland, swept away by the darkening violence in downtown Oakland. There's like these repeated headlines from the East Bay Times, I don't know if this publication, that every time it was like some form of internecine violence, like stabbing or whatever, they'd be like, the darkening violence, and that it's actually kind of wild that they repeated it every year. They just rolled out the show. Swept in the public outcry, the spectacle of darkening violence, drowning out the whirring white noise of deadly mechanistic urban redevelopment, which has now become much more privately marketized. We don't really need Ford Foundation money in the same kind of way that we did in the 60s, right? The inescapable architecture of scaffolding, broadcasting an all surrounding soundtrack of in construction. So the in construction is Miller Maze windows were an experimental medium of memory, services mediating autonomous relations between life and death, offering a fragile precipice where the prurience of a look and the waywardness of a reflection flirted and ranged. Why you're here and they're there was an unequal intimacy or an occasion for war. But the vacant condo windows across ruined cities have emerged as the experimental medium of the endless exchange between forms of state power and neoliberal capital. An asymmetry so evacuated of its original oppositions that it installs the suzerainty of its outside. The superficial publics of parklets, for example, public parklets, virtually populated developer renderings, which we could look at a version of. I think people have like an image of this. Like, I think it's really interesting. In San Francisco, they'll use developer renderings, which I could put one up later, that often have like fancy Black people on them for something that is clearly going to be a project that probably doesn't even have fancy Black people on it. So I just think that's a really fascinating kind of interesting form of almost proto representation of governance that's happening with those images, right? It's very interesting. I can put up an image later, but so these kind of superficial publics, right? Public parklets, virtually populated developer renderings, and the endless prosthesis of hostile architecture, right, which has a similar kind of evacuated public that it projects for the purpose of creating something that's very I wouldn't even say anti-public, anti-person or something like that, right? So like a bench, but a bench with spikes, right? This idea that rather than just spikes, you know, what would it be? It's just, or no bench, right? But it's a very interesting site of harassment and harm and yeah, and how that relates to the thing. This is a quote from Decristo. I wish I could take the credit for it. Vanished from our cities. There are no longer any ghosts who can remind the living of reciprocity. Right? There's nothing in them. Those lobbies are empty. These condos are empty. The work of art's latent potential to manifest a shared interiority is diffused into its refusal to make an enemy of anyone. I'm really interested in that idea that art's predicated on non-hostility and like not having an enemy in a political sense that we can think of them. And that is why no one lives here, right? So art's shared interiority is diffused into its refusal to make an enemy out of anyone, and that's why no one lives here. Perhaps ironically, the condo's value, voluminously decorated in Black images, is much higher than if they were occupied and potentially undone by Black life, which is not necessarily to say Black people, right? Because lots of fancy Black people could live in it eventually. Maybe. The capacities of Blackness, these images bearing, the capacities of Blackness these images bear, barring the door against Black living. Black art cannot cause the buildings empty to depart from its own character. Because the fullness of Black sound imaging increasingly and automatically shares the productive function of that emptiness, right? So what about the productive function of that emptiness, right? That I think increasingly Black art has. And this is contra to something like the Black arts, which I think, you know, and a lot of some people who they read about the Black public cultures, like dance cultures. I think these things that kind of frankly scared real estate away, scared white people away, were different. You know, it'd be like maybe something different. Public sex, other kinds of things that de-speculate, I guess you could say. So Black art cannot cause the buildings empty to depart from its own character because the fullness of Black sound imaging or Black art, we can say, increasingly and automatically shares the productive function of that emptiness. Contrary to Kant, no living Black person's labor or lighting could be the subject of this automation, right? That's not what it's about. But could certainly tear it all down against the surface of Black art. After all, what kind of Black art can fundamentally devalue the world that lets it be beautiful without its sins? What might it mean to squat the gravestones with our living against and beyond this beautiful herbarium? So I'm very interested again in something like an herbarium or a museum, but I would love, you know, I'm really interested in like a mass squatting movement. I'll just say that. I would love because there's so much intentionally empty produced housing and there's so much houses. How are we doing? I have more. So in the final chapter, I'm going to look more at kind of the place of the Black arts movement, which I referred to a little bit, and specifically Baldwin's kind of pejorative of protest art, which I like, as a way to contest the common framing of the Black arts movement, in which his words found home, ready to lead with kind of, and people like Larry Neal cite this. This idea that Black art is merely this smooth and sort of tame tributary flowing into our expansively aesthetic present. Though the Black arts movement forms a more explicit discursive object of the way I write about Black art later, I'm not just writing about the Black arts movement. I hope that I am still working in its radical provocations, which really interests me. So while the forms of some of these and related murals revolve around recognizable configurational acts, embodying this familiar, appealing figure, right? I mean, in a historical time of protest, right? I mean, I think we think a few years ago, we could say that. Encapsulated in the 1960s as well, the aesthetics of the Black Power movement, something to talk a little bit about, or we could bring into the space. The Black arts movement, the social realist spirit of the mission school, which is in my very Bay Area, kind of not exclusively, but a Bay Area reference, or even the vibrant iconographies or muralism of Obasha or what became Apricobra. People like Carolyn Lawrence, Wadsworth Jarrell, people that I discuss in the end of the book. It's easy for us to forget the attendant and often antagonistic voicings and sounds that raged against these artists, their forms, and the now edified social world we regard as their art. So there's a lot of the canonization of the Black arts movement was happening a few years ago when I started writing. In levying the accusation of protest, Baldwin sought to castigate work not simply in form but in force, whose effects stood upon white appeal, and hence overdetermine the form and formalization of Black needs within a paradigm of pleading and begging for our humanity. What protest art achieves for Baldwin is that it incidentalizes Black needs under the form of their exposition. I think this is a really good example. In other words, they become, Black needs become, and this is a quote from that essay by Baldwin, neatly framed and incontestable like those mottos sometimes found hanging on the walls of furnished rooms. Black life is quickly sublimated to and decorative of the representation it produces, the misfortune of its very sounding image. The domestication is similarly present and perilous in the racial hyperbole of Richard Wright's literary realism, which Baldwin is directly responding to, as it is in the sentimental romantic appeal of 18th and 19th century abolitionist media. I'm thinking particularly of the lineage between, say, We Can't Breathe and Am I Not a Man and a Brother, and the Josiah Wedgwood carving image. And Frederick Douglass's imaging in the 19th century that I discussed elsewhere in the chapter following this, as it is in the litigious formalism of the Black Lives Matter sign, hung in the window of a gentrifying business, that's always a popular one, or a freshly flipped, gray-scaled remodel in a decreasingly Black neighborhood. Yeah. Well, Baldwin, in line with many of the Black arts movement theorists like Larry Neal and Mary Baraka, who I talked about, alluded to the whiteness of this abyss left as the internalized receptive modality of the Black work of art. It may be more clearly or helpfully understood for us now as the void of the condo window vacancy, the receptive frontier of more and more of our cultural production. Right? I mean, I think it's really interesting. We live in a moment where there's more and more Black art, but there's also more and more Black people in prison. There seems like kind of a maybe crass thing to point out, but also like that's true. Like we are represented in other ways. The effective humanization of empty spaces, endless shiny punishment of the landscape, is not no capacity, right? I don't really agree with that concept. I don't know where that comes from. But actually an increased capacity conflated with what Marx alluded to as too much civilization, might not be the best word. The capitalist overproduction circumscribes as it makes it isomorphic to our needs, right? And one of those would be the needs for representation, which is now a need. Was always the case. The liberated domination of representations labor, its increasingly loose fetters, placebo social fulfillment, and its mounting automated authority require Black work in a deeply processual way that the blatant tokenization of the work belies. Black art is increasingly deputized, and I would use the word deputized intentionally, into the invisibilized authority of social relations. It makes the commodity as it casts its lot in the verticality of valuation. By spurning the horizontality of mutual community for the vague chance to convince or elicit consent by those from without, which is the collective Black esteem envisioned, however reductively at times, critiques of it, from the Harlem Renaissance to the Black arts movement, has since been appropriated and made very similar with building the esteem of institutions and the market in Black art, right? I think there's been this really, often I used to talk about with artists, I think this goes up with lots of artists from kind of targeted backgrounds about how impossible it feels like to have something like the Black arts movement or Harlem Renaissance happen again. Yet we've absolutely liberated the institutions that those things were reacting against, which, yeah, I mean, we could talk about those. But it feels all the more possible to get into a museum, I guess. I don't think if that's why escape from what into what? This is a great time. Out from under the genealogy of Black art as the technology of a mythic positive freedom. There was like some like instrumental rationality. There was always an increasingly escapist tendency. I think of this back to the slave narrative, but an escape from what into what. Since the late 1960s, museums' mission of cultural decentralization would become the prominent mode of institutional expansion, but the form of decentralization predicated on the increasingly violent inclusion, right? What's violent about neoliberalism is always how it includes us, of Black life and culture is not distinct to the institution of the museum, nor the formal allowances of what is called art. What is put to work in the work of art. What the aesthetic character of Blackness of the book attempts to chart is how and to what degree, and to a degree when, Blackness has been enlisted to art value, right? To art value. To enact the force of its centralization, right? It's a point I tell my students a lot, right? This institution needs you more than you need it, right? These institutions wouldn't exist without Black people and targeted people. And we are more central to the decentralization / propping up of these institutions than whatever was the against white artists, whatever. The force of its property making and even its proprioception, how it looks at the world, how we look at the world. My argument is not necessarily historical, which I'm happy to chat in those terms, but a scattered genealogy of force. And perhaps ironically, this force would effectively ensnare orthodox purveyors of Black culture in the Harlem Renaissance to the Black arts movement and its afterlives, as much as it would capture the emerging class of Black artists and operators who wish to separate the self-making capacities of the Black artist from the cultural plenipotentiary function of a work. And I'll say what I mean by that. I think that was, maybe still is, a very common mode, kind of like maybe post-90s. Modeled more in our current time, cultural nationalisms can comfortably cohabitate with Black art that would increasingly self-consciously claim cultural nationalism as the impetus of its artistic escape. In this space, these escapist tendencies submit themselves to the ultimate yet inherent and innate parody of self-possession. This art has become arguably the greatest emissary of art institutionalization. An art and architect of the frame that framed the work, the museum that framed the frame, the neighborhood that housed the museum, the occupied land, the artist would fashion in its honor. So, again, if we're going to look at artists as producers and workers, then I think there has to be a critique of that, the way we would criticize all work under capitalism, right? Not like some weird union argument or something like that. And unions are fine sometimes, but we need them, but it's not the only kind of mode under which art should art. There arose Black art that would increasingly maintain the reflective authority of aesthetic comportment, Kant term, but also the way someone like Elaine Locke would talk about Black art, despite, if not against, the representative authority whose open graves it taunts. I think this felt increasingly like the place of being a Black artist volunteering for the graveyard shift, as it complains about being made to toil in total darkness. Darby English contends that right, and also the volunteerism is really interesting, and I'll talk about this at the end if we have time, right? It's like people do the shit for free. A lot of times people do the most just absolutely very nonprofit industrial cut, people do the most foul fucking shit for free, and they got a half-drank glass of bottle of water to get paid, it's not even that it was like, I needed to get paid, sis. It's like you got, I gave you a bag of Cheez-Its. Darby English contends that the historical events, and I'm sure probably about this, I don't know, but Darby English contends that the historical events and developments on the near side of racism, very interesting phrase, coalesce as an infrasensory opacity that bounds Black art through judgment, a space which he terms total darkness, that Black art may only be conscripted reflectively to narrate and document forms of Black life, right? I think this is kind of one of his critiques, some like protest art, for example, or that all art is, all Black art is protest art. The near side of racism, however, may be no more than the effective inside of the condo window's opaque tinting. What works inside? What works against the eagerness of those who would smash the glass entirely? In the rented room of one's own, in one's own temporary artist residency, in one's own pacification of the landlord's passive income, the admonition of the bondsman is bypassed. What decorates this inside is the internalization of superficial blame, elevated to possessive ressentiment and institutional paranoia. Not nearsighted, but short-sighted in its safeguarding of the provisional protection as art and artist. Right, so I mean, I think one of the things is there's a kind of proto-respectability argument that one would make, like, or maybe it's like an inscription of something that someone would, like Adorno would maybe actually hold this, and like, that's not serious, right? I think people would make that critique of, like, the things I'm looking at, and some of the things in the book, like, that's not serious Black art. Serious Black art wouldn't be afflicted with these problems, but I think if we go back to someone like Adorno, he would say, oh, they're just as guilty as mass-produced work, they're just as guilty as, But then it's also, why is the near side of racism fantasy is a very guilt-ridden fantasy, which I think is very academic too. A lot of academics that are like that. This is not the affliction of Black art, but a symptom of the desire for Black property, which is what I think it's really about, to be honest. Black works, black work, suffers from poverty. For all the institutionalization of black art says is that black art too has become the condo windows collected in cells. What is imagined as the protected, hung along, unlived luxury interiors, the speculated space of value that need never appear, need never be made audible. It is not merely the sentimental reinscription of enlightenment empathy, but the mechanized stultification of its imaginative form of carving out a space in the perpetual future, because it's always a perpetual future, of an endlessly produced other. Mounting empty real estate now adopts the persuasive function of artistic contents, with far less and far more policed graffiti to contest it. I mean, we can see what this. What is that? Black Panther. Outside that. I didn't put the fake graffiti. Okay, we'll come back to this. There's a condo in that's where I get my hair done, and I'm gonna put up fake graffiti outside the wall. So I just think that was like a really good, like, and it has these art lighting lights. This is in a gallery booklet, and it's just fascinating to me. The concession has for some time been, in the invocation, only the frame can authorize the work of art. Against the automated aesthetic character of blackness, English imagines an authorial power, right? This is also where we're going, authorial power, authority. One sublimated to the institutional and state forms of authorship and authority of the artist, and for that matter, the Black critic. Which is also some genealogy of the Black arts movement, right? To go back to your Brock, the Jasmine White critic. Beyond the ethical demands of Black community that I will discuss through artists like Larry Neal, Mary Brock of the Black arts movement. I look a lot at Chicago in particular, really interesting stuff done with Obishad, the Came Africa. Whereas the lines drawn by murals like From All of Respect were carved out against Black extinction, and there's a really interesting relationship to that piece in relationship to urban renewal. Increasingly, those lines are enlisted to differently draw the streets commemorating the territories of our disappearance. Right, so like, I mean, now murals are used to evict, which is before they were, maybe not before, but there are moments or times where they're used to defend against eviction, theoretically. Right, so it's really sad, but interesting to think about that when murals are used to evict. When will we stop ornamenting the edges of our progressive dystopias? That's from Sudan. Oddly, the murals draw out the increasingly diminished space between the urgency of the world we need and want now, and a feigned communal promise, an explicit community benefits agreement for a world yet to come for us, for Black needs. Against, and the against cannot be shouted enough, and can never be shouted as the positive character of the work of art. For the shout is still necessary, still needed against a safeguarded propriety that sonically and visually baffles the shriek of a latent and imminent Black world. What was here before us, and what must be for us? What must be more of us here again? So what was here before us, and what must be more of us here again? Sorry. These are now no longer separated, but quite insidiously yoked by 1 inch of polarized condo glass. However, no matter how private the form of authorship, right? And I think this all goes back to this room of one's own fantasy. No matter how deep it's privileged, the fantastical private law of its domain, it remains sealed in the form of personal property, which there is more of now on earth than at any point in history. Yet fewer and fewer people on the means of production as long as the artistic freedom, the liberation of which is merely bound by the force that sent it, or better, by the racist capitalist world that it liberates. For the product and propriety of self-making, the Black artist has so often been the deputy of the world's positively represented paranoia. Right, so I mean that's what property is, right? It's positively represented paranoia. Actually have a thing, have the fear around the thing. Right, so gated communities are fucked, right? The right to die in a gated community. Sorry, I'm thinking of a story from around here. The student from one of my students brought it up when I taught this. Like, oh my God. Refracting the behemoth of its increasingly negative possession, so the paranoia, into a plenipotentiary of a popular culture with increasingly less Black people, right? So when you think of popular people, it's very, these interesting things happen. It is not just Black culture that has been besieged by the hustle and the hustler, as Lester K. Spence work suggests. I wrote a book on that. I teach it all the time. Still very much the mode we're in. Initially in residual opposition to, and then subsumed by, which I think is the way to look at this kind of hustle, right? Only to then be channeled as the machinations of racial capital, the grind no longer merely responds to, but also actively casts the form of capital's contrapuntal cadences, right? So I mean, we think of if things like the kind of hustler relationship a lot of artists had. I think even survival this way as an artist, maybe not the best word, right? Is kind of something. So kind of a reactive mode to survival. I actually think this is more the active way capitalism is produced. People like Veronica Gago talk about proletarianization by neoliberalism. So I think we could think of this hustle as actually not the hey, I'm just getting by. A lot of times it's like the active and how we're producing the predominant means of production, class production. The translation of Black relationality into an effectively prodigious, but decidedly uninhabited representational politic is too easily conflated with community, right? You've dealt with organizing and they've talked to the community before they're doing this, what that is like. We're the nonprofit that speaks on behalf of the community, the arts nonprofit. One mural and you can build 20 condos. Increase, we got the community's signature. The increased familiarity and impending, which I think is really, familiarity is another important part, kind of intimacy, and impending closing distance of forms of Black-led Black art with articulations of state power and market exploitation, not only symbolize an escape from the slave form of property, for example, which the aftermath of which the whole book is about the aftermath, but more profoundly, they presage an because I don't want to say like, I'm on this trying to move away from like this, we are slaves or something like that. Like that's not really, that's actually where, if we say that, then all this goes away. I think that's the problem with that critique. They're like, we as slaves, we was kings, and that's the thing when I was growing up, now we're slaves. It's queens, not in that way. Right, because all this goes away. It's like it doesn't really help us understand. It might not, well, I mean, there are helpful things about it. So they not only symbolize the freedom of website, lest we forget the insidiousness of private nonprofit foundations and enlistment of, and so something I talk about, when people are familiar with it, we could talk about it, that's okay, Freddie Fixer and the Ford Foundation's work in this time, this going back to the 50s and 60s, and sort of anti-poverty money and things like that. Confession that a facade of coarse Black communal intimacy with police. So things I grew up with, athletic leagues, church inclusion, diversity recruitment, and proverbial ride-alongs. If anyone, have any kind of Boys and Girls Club thing that was just like how to become friends with cops, and a lot of art. The only kind of art things I had access to as a kid were those too. There really wasn't, art classes that weren't like, you have art is a way to like pre-police you, to pre-crime you out of like, because otherwise you're going to join a gang or something. So I just, it's very, anyway. The lesson of the 18th century sounding image of a fictive slave, look at Emma and her brother in the book, teaches us that Black tokenization was and is integral to humanizing the modes of capture and possession, which is what I think is actually the projections of a reinscribed past, as well as the endless frontier of a future valuation, right? So like a lot of the book, I talk about how valuation was produced after the abolition of slavery, and obviously those modes of production and elsewhere, and the work that we tend to think of as slave labor, but how kind of cultural labor for Black people became such a big thing after slavery, or before it, in the abolitionism. So much of the theorization. Oh, we're almost done. So this is also a confessional thing. I think I was talking about some grad students earlier. Part of this monograph comes out of, and I was encouraged to put this in here, so it didn't seem to anchor things. I'll just say that. Part of this monograph comes out of my experience and disillusionment as a Black artist, when I far too often found that the respectability and cultural value were cachet of Black art institutionalization conflated with something like James Baldwin's reluctant sense of artistic integrity, which I kind of like the way he writes about that. I forget the name of the piece, but it has artistic integrity. Far too often operated as a conveyance, David's terms, of power's imaginative faculties, even when cloaked in the contents of its symbolic contestation. I watched and confronted numerous fellow Black artists in the Bay Area. I don't live there anymore. They either moved on to greener pastures or got pushed out by the art they made, who justified making work that adorned and to varying degrees consciously legitimated the conceptual aegis of projects, spaces, and yes, even corporations, whose directives and market aspirations sought to police, imprison, displace, and drive towards the brink of death the very Black audiences these Black artists claimed their work acknowledged and celebrated, right? So I think this a really big point of personal artistic contestation they kind of split me, like a lot of people and some other friends of mine. Was this invention of art murmur, which is in the footnotes of this. I don't know if people know what art murmur is in Oakland specifically, but it was really, like a lot of art murmurs, this kind of like artification or gentrification of downtown Oakland to kind of make it a vibrant artistic community, right? So sort of beautifying the Black, which they've been trying to do since the 70s in the first Black community. Is that my playing off music? No. Oh, okay. So that was a really big dividing point. And a lot of the people spot, and I remember this real estate development firm actually sent this very studied Black developer down to talk to a lot of Black artists, and we'd go to every Black art scene and everything. I was like, who's this guy? I don't know if I can say his name. I guess like his name is Michael Orange. I don't think that's what it says. He was like, and he was like talking to me about like Killer Sheep, and like, which is my favorite film of all time. He's talking about like Black film, and he was talking. He knew everything. I don't know, maybe he just actually knew these things. And you'd be like, here's my card. This was like, and it wasn't like a Vistaprint card too. So you're like, oh wow. And he was like, let me present you with our opportunities. And I eventually looked up who he was. He worked for the biggest real estate developer in Chicago, which had helped destroy the south side of Chicago. And it was this was when LinkedIn was new, so yeah, they had it. Anyway, I could talk more about it, but I'll wrap. The reason was rarely the reason for collaborating with the likes of him. The reason was rarely as simple as money. None of, as I mentioned earlier, none of them then or now were compensated anything broaching an impressive fee, and were often instead, one of my favorite phrases, paid in exposure. The figment of compensatory publicity is now even conveyance for something, was something to be rewarded with and subjected to, seemed not just a recent advent of petty neoliberal Black capital, but rather an old aesthetic voluntaristic ploy. I go back to some of my previous killer. Voluntaristic ploy that conscripted Black labor to build or convey the representative power of the world. The representation of being represented that aesthetics endear us to. So I wanted to focus less on the interpretive contents or even forms of a Black aesthetic genealogy, like in art history, for example, because those too would soon adorn a condo on the soil wet with our footprints, memorializing our presence. The enduring long 1960s or even 1990s condemnation of the sellout hardly seems to work anymore. It hardly seems to fit, given that not only were these artists not selling anything, they were often not being paid, so we can't legally, we technically call that selling. But the cultural landscape or landscaping, term from Adorno, in which selling out can be differentiated, has been disappeared, right? There is no need to sell out. There is no more underground from which to defect. Rather, a sea of artists already waiting to make it. I wonder what forms of poetic heresy-seeking practice of Blackness be in common, which I think is promoting a critique of Blackness that is invested in property, as Baldwin intoned. I really like this quote from him because it also is like about responsibility, which I guess it's not. That's what that. The artist can do it. The price that he has to pay himself and that you, the audience, must also pay is a willingness to give up everything. To realize that although you spent 27 years acquiring this house, this furniture, this position, although you spent 40 years raising this child, these children, nothing, none of it belongs to you. You can take if you are prepared to give, and giving is not an investment or investment property. How to steal back our lives, our living, our work, and our needs back from this fantastical investment property, of which our only occupation is ever only in its defense, right? Only on protecting the class. It is never real beyond our constant paranoid defensive, right? Not on anything. It is an immense task, which again, people double down on defending the less and less we know, which is fascinating. It's an immense task that this work hopes to imagine and think us into. How do we live and make beyond the imaginative limitations of the aesthetic character of Black?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Decristo. I'm Anthea. It's my pleasure to facilitate Q&A. There's a couple people still on Zoom. I don't know if you can hear me, Maria and Jose. But you're welcome to type questions in the chat. But if anyone wants to start us off here in the audience with a question. Go ahead.
I was wondering, did you talked about graffiti being used as like an aesthetic, but did you see folks resisting this kind of art? Like, did you see them trying to cover it up or not refuse to do work with these condos? Or
well, I definitely know people who did. I know people who did do the murals, but it is my intention to like not name because it's like, and it's because they're like, they're not rich or anything. It's like, I don't, but, and then I know people who did. So like, no, the brief experience I had with these was, allegedly, people went out following some of the murals and tried to like take the plywood down and other things. And there were people who were like, no, these have like George Floyd murals on them now, which is really interesting. I mean, it's like the way policy works. It's like the George Floyd thing. Like you're like, no, how dare you? This is in this person's honor, which I think is really interesting. Like, and I don't know what I don't say I don't know what you do with that, but like, it's hard at that moment to be like, look, this is protecting a condo that that was made so you can't come back to this neighborhood. It's also the I don't know if this answer goes. I mean, there are people that definitely refuse it, and there's some people that like kind of care. I don't know if it's like an absolute scorched earth thing. But I think what it brought up for me was like how you have esteem without that vertical, because one of the things my partner brought up to me was well, what do you do with like people who don't want to live in what gets called blighted later, and it's true. Like, what do you do with that, or what do you do with beauty? I mean, because people are like, oh, this does honor, or this does, I don't know. And there, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
I was covered. There was about
Oh, the end racism one? Sure. All right.
Interesting, the lack of space. That would be right. Not just end all racism, but end all and what is the end all and be all of it? That.
And your question is just what do I think of it? Or did you know?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, I mean that one. I don't know who made that, but it almost feels fake. It almost feels like, what was the thing that the white person, they were like, the blacks or whatever, that was sprayed on the person, like, it was like, what was it, like, the blacks rule or something, blacks, it almost feels like that. But I believe someone took that and had some kind of, I mean, to me, I think it's one of the things where in organizing, we'll often, in the group I'm in, we'll often talk about how, like, irony is dead and we couldn't make something that would be more ironic than what actually life is. And I think that's kind of it, right? Because it's like the whole time the person was making it, they're above this condo sign that's about leasing with, like it's, and I don't know, I mean, I think it's the thing that I'm thinking about is this, I mean, it's also this broader, of course, like broader accumulative, speculative impulse, in capitalism where it's like, I don't think it has to take the name as under the name. I don't want to like completely, although it definitely comes off as this, I think in the intro, I don't want to completely fetishize like a certain kind of insurrectionary kind of like outlook. As much as I am like, well, you could have just thrown rocks to the windows and left no sign. Fight against racism than doing the mural. But I do think there's a lot of other ways, that like there's a tendency of like, and that's why I'm like the positive character of art, right? To like, it has to be a something, it has to be put forth. It can't not be, you know what I mean? And people can't let go of that putting forth. Like they'll take it over, you could be paid in a box of animal crackers to like do a mural on a building you're being evicted from. And for some reason that is just too tempting to putting forth, so like, versus the not putting forth, which I think in this case, what you like, I mean, I don't know, that's why I also brought up squatting, because I'm like, well, that's not destroying, that's the opposite. It's like actually living against the kind of living or dwelling, which is really the living of capital, right? Because it's meant to be lived as empty spaces or not lived, but to be lived on the stock market valuations. I think of that as like another way to like the end all racism. You could just, I mean, you could even just tear the thing down, the plywood that's would be more of an end racism thing, or yeah, squat the condos, I mean, and that doesn't involve a kind of, I don't think as much a fantasy of destruction. I think there's other ways to kind of blight value, if that's like lack of a better term, that aren't, I mean, public sex is one of those things. Have people living, I mean, I'm not like we're romanticizing people living in the street, but it's like such little nothing that people get to live with is so offensive to that model of value. Just people living on a tent on the street, just, makes rich people know that, yeah. So I don't know, yeah. I think to me that's sort of my, it's obviously is like a very vague, kind of liberal appeal, whatever. And just all racism is bad. Love is, it's like the love is love. And it's kind of a little what Dylan was alluding to, so you're to go. Of the like what grassroots, kind of the way it is appropriated. And now we're in an era where abolition means not a lot of the things it meant. It doesn't mean actually getting back to that Baldwin quote, doesn't mean actually getting rid of stuff or giving things up. It's like people, I mean, it's the litigiousness of it's this legal accretion, right? It's like more and more and more. Oh, we need more and more policy against to it, rather than less and less law, which is actually what is like. More and more law will always kill more and more Black people. I have so much. There's literally no example I can think of that would be true. It will always be used to police the most marginalized Black folks, sex workers, trans stuff. Like it will always, undocumented. And there's something that is so. It's not just. I think it's written in Democracy too, which is also about a lot of the representation of this, right? It's not just to the extent that we can separate democracy and capitalism. I don't know, but I think it's absolutely written in Democracy too. Entirely, and that's why it's like the kind of leaky government term of the suzerainty, these anti-standing, these other kind of words that have that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel I'm like tortured by this talk in a good way. Like we were just talking earlier, like I'm a screenwriter and like that's a disaster. But I was thinking about when you were talking about how Black labor has been conscripted to convey the representation power. I think I got that right. And it made me think about, again, screenwriters, so I just think about like after the murder of George Floyd, what we then saw on TV, like every cop was in black, right? Like we fixed it. DC National Cop, congratulations. Like, and like how, and then talking a little before that about like after abolition, how like black labor has been transmuted into cultural labor, and like I'm just wondering if I'm wondering if like there's a way to, I don't know if there's an answer to this, like, I don't know, that culture, this is part of my own, I guess, these questions, and I'm just like, with the cultural labor that we're just like giving up, like you said, for animal crackers, I don't know, is there a way to make that, like, thinking about the Black arts movement and when it was so infused with like, having a sense of community care and like being horizontal. Do you think there's any way to get back there where has power to just do everything and we just stuck with Nash and the house?
That's a great question.
I don't know.
I think about this a lot, and I think kind of at the end it came out of very much a lot of this book, especially as it sort of changed towards the end, it came out of this. And I mean, there's kind of two questions I think, or at least one, I think this might either be Dylan or maybe the state. It might be someone else. I'm quoting. I say, ask the state for something, and it'll give it to you in the form of police. And I think that's pretty direct, but maybe the market too. It's absolutely the case with Hollywood. It's like anything people feel like, all right, we'll give you a black cop, or like a black politician, whatever, some version, like you can think of of who else gets to police or who else gets to so I do think that's true. That yes, I guess the first part is what you're saying. And it's true, and it's also this history of the appropriation of like kind of black radical struggle, even going back to things, going back to the Roman system. I mean, I think it's also a way to look at it that to say that is absolutely even more intensely written into kind of versions of the abolitionist movement too. Right, that I think a lot of people like Harman or something, a lot of folks would talk about the Reconstruction period and be like, right, all of the kind of surplus legal production around that Black people were, sublimated to, or like through which the recently enslaved, or that took place through the recently enslaved, was not like necessarily what Black people were asking, right? And that, just as slavery wasn't a debate, specifically to Black. So like that is also kind of a longer way to look at the kind of history of appropriation that I do think is also kind of sort of democratic, not just state, democratic ethos maybe. The Black Arts Movement question, I think about that in very, kind of concrete terms. I remember seeing this, this is kind of not an answer to it, but there was this queer artist, which is white, older lady, who was like at this queer art thing, and people were, I forget what the piece, they made this really famous piece, I'm not remember the name, that was on TV in the 70s, that was like the first mainstream thing about queer identity on PBS. And they made it all collectively and everything like that. And someone asked her, how do you could we do that again? And she's like, well, to be honest, I live on SSI. She said, and she's like, I'm not rich and I'm kind of barely getting by, but she's like, God, I feel that's so bad for young people. Like, I don't know how you would do, like, we were able to make this thing we made and like still work part-time at a restaurant, And this is to people, Dylan's not here, but I think this is the way a lot of nonprofits sort of prosper, unfortunately, or prosper, is people think like the only way I can do the thing is getting paid to do it, And I don't know. I mean, maybe that is changing now. I think it's gotten so bad. I don't know if that, I'm not really like an acceleration, but I mean, like, I think certainly locally there are ways people can do things. I do think it's possible to have artistic community without kind of staking out, or I think you have to be kind of vigilant in the way like people would maybe think of like principles and analysis needing to be vigilant and responsive around not producing certain kinds of values or something. I don't have I mean, I think like when I talked about squatting it, and I'm like, that always seems like because a lot of, like say filmmakers, or this was a big thing with musicians, would be like, we don't have a place to play, which was true. That was a really big issue, especially as Oakland in particular, Strip San Francisco, of course, even before that, got so expensive, and there were just a few, you know, all the little galleries and stuff closed that had kind of helped context be built. I think people have to kind of look into things like squatting spaces, which is not that unusual for, like, you know, sort of punkish aesthetics. And I thought was really quite under the whole history of it, but really like a couple weeks ago, they had a punk show on the park. I thought that was cool. And I always wish I lived in 90s San Francisco, but apparently that was very common in the Muni tunnels and stuff like that. And there is a lot of that in like rave culture and other things where people just steal space. I think that people, you know, people have to do it because it means that much to them, right? Too. It's like, you know, animal crackers are not enough or whatever. Or girls who, yeah. You know, like, and it's real. Like, I think you have to be like, we need this. You know, this is a need, not. You know, and there's a broader thing. There's broader things. Now, I think social media has made that really hard. There's like this fantasy of you getting something, being I mean, all that was happening when I was, you know, 10 years ago or so when I first started this. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's possible, but I don't completely write it off. I don't know what it'll look like. I look down. Some of it is also I struggle with getting rid of that nostalgia too, or not nostalgia, but like nostalgia in the true sense that I never lived through it. Like, you know, so for me it never existed in that way. Like, I don't know, you know, it'll look different. I think giving up some relationships to art institutionality. Film is a big one. I don't know. You know, it seems so expensive.
It's interesting just thinking about, you know, the labor thing, because so many like programs and things have popped up for like Black people and queer folks and like undocumented people. And then you do one of these programs, it's a lot of work and we're not getting paid. Mm-hmm. So it's like, but again, it's like that chance to be, it's like you were saying, trying to find speed without verticality. And it's like a way, it's another sort of vertical, you know, you could possibly ascend and get, but it's like, you're really not getting paid. To do more work to be represented, right?
Well, and that's like the way professionalization works under institutionality. We all work in an institution that doesn't really pay us for a lot of the work we do, but it's kind of conflated with this very vague, you know, tenure or otherwise sense of professionalization. I think that's absolutely related to it. That's very much a verticality kind of concept that is, you know, is funny and fucked up because you actually, the people you meet, I mean, you know, whole conversation about nepotism in the arts too, but the people you meet that are like very successful don't have that professional, but you know, they're just like, oh, I decided I want to be an artist one day. It was got me a gallery. You know, like, I mean, there was so many, that also, at like sometime 10 years ago, kind of broke me with me. I didn't thankfully go to art school, but a lot of friends I did. Even as far back as the 80s and 90s, friends who were older than me were like, or generation older than me were like, oh yeah, that was when I just kind of like, I can't do it. Like someone would come out of Mills or something, or to a music program with North at the time, and they would just, you know, have an art gallery and then have some white art. And I think it is letting go of those things. It's in certification processes and these kind of I mean, I don't know if you know, I mean, I think the way I was trying to think about it in this is that kind of, I don't know if it's a little maybe too harsh of a thing to put on professionalization, I guess, but it is kind of deputization. You know, it is a kind of like, I get to, it's what distinguishes me from, I think of this for myself, this was such a big, the way education was framed to me, it's what makes me different from the people in the community I grew up in. So, just certifications. I don't know how, I mean, I think there's some answers to how to do it, but I think you're right. I think it's a scam. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we're right at time. I think you'd like help me thank again, Dr. Decristo. And still enough for facilitating the visit. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.